It's late 1943, and the war in Europe is burning hotter than ever. Across the skies over France and Germany, the American P-38 Lightning roars like a beast, twin engines, twin tails, and a reputation for being both brilliant and deadly. But there's a problem. A deadly one. Pilots keep dying, not from enemy fire, but from the Lightning itself. The same plane that was supposed to dominate the sky is killing the men who fly it. Nobody can figure out why. At first, they think it's pilot error. Maybe men are diving too fast, pulling too many Gs, or panicking. But soon the pattern becomes too clear. Experienced pilots, aces even, are losing control during high-speed dives. The nose locks down, the controls freeze, and the plane becomes a coffin. At 400 miles per hour, it doesn't matter how strong or skilled you are. Gravity wins every time. 1 second, the pilot's fighting to pull up. The next, he's a fireball in the ground. In the engineering offices back home, this mystery turns into an obsession. Lockheed's design team knows the P-38's speed is both its strength and its curse. As it dives faster, something invisible starts happening. The air around the plane behaves differently, something nobody fully understands yet. It's compressibility, a phenomenon new to aviation at the time. At high speeds, air can't move around the wings and control surfaces like it used to. It gets dense, unpredictable, almost like hitting a wall of invisible water. And the P-38, being one of the first planes fast enough to hit those speeds, is paying the price. Meanwhile, in the field, the pilots are running out of patience. The plane that's supposed to be their shield in combat feels more like a trap. One of them is James McKenna, a maintenance sergeant stationed in England. He's not a pilot. He's not a scientist. But he's the kind of man who pays attention. Every time a Lightning goes down, he notices the same thing in the wreckage. The elevator cables are intact, but stretched tight as if someone tried to pull the stick with all their strength. He listens to the pilots who survive the dives, their voices shaking as they describe how the controls lock solid at high speed. To McKenna, it doesn't sound like a mystery. It sounds mechanical. Something about how the tail moves when the air pressure builds up. One night after another funeral, McKenna can't sleep. He walks back to the hangar and stands under the silver belly of a Lightning, its engines cold and silent. He stares at the tail, runs his hand along the control surfaces, and thinks about the problem. The pilots are pulling back on the stick, but the air pressure is so strong it forces the tailplane down instead of up. The more they fight, the worse it gets. What if, he wonders, they could reinforce that movement, give the elevator just a bit of extra muscle against the air pressure? But how? He starts experimenting quietly. He takes a length of piano wire from a local supply, thin but strong, the kind used to repair musical instruments on bass. It's durable, flexible, and can handle tension. He threads it through part of the elevator linkage, reinforcing the control cables. It's a crazy idea, something nobody has approved, and if the brass finds out, he could be court-martialed. But McKenna doesn't care. Too many pilots have died already. He rigs the system so the elevator responds more directly, reducing the lag between the stick and the control surface. Then one foggy morning, he convinces a pilot to try it. The man looks at him like he's insane, but agrees. The pilot takes off, circles, and then dives fast. 350 miles per hour, 380, 400. He's expecting the stick to freeze, but it doesn't. The Lightning holds steady. When he pulls back, the nose responds. Slowly at first, then firmly. He levels out, alive and shaking. Over the radio, he's yelling, almost laughing. It worked. McKenna's piano wire fix, simple and almost stupid in its simplicity, has just solved one of the biggest mysteries in aviation at the time. Word spreads fast across the base. Mechanics start copying the modification quietly. Pilots begin trusting the Lightning again. For the first time in months, they feel like the plane is listening to them. McKenna becomes a legend in whispers. Officially, nothing has changed. Unofficially, everyone knows something has. But McKenna's work doesn't stay secret for long. Engineers from Lockheed eventually hear about the field fix and fly over to see it for themselves. When they crawl under the tail of the modified P-38, they're stunned. This simple piece of piano wire has achieved something they've been struggling with in labs for months. Back in California, Lockheed engineers begin refining the idea. They redesign parts of the tail assembly, improving the hydraulic balance and adding dive recovery flaps under the wings to reduce compressibility effects. McKenna's improvisation becomes the seed of a permanent solution, one that will save hundreds of pilots before the war ends. But at that moment, standing in the muddy airfield with the sound of engines in the distance, James McKenna doesn't think about history. He's just relieved that his friends might finally come home alive. The war continues, and the Lightning earns its place as one of the most feared aircraft in the sky. Its twin engines give it a reach and power few fighters can match. In Europe, it escorts bombers deep into German territory. In the Pacific, it dominates long-range missions across endless ocean. And in both theaters, pilots who once feared the deadly dive now push the plane harder than ever, confident in the fixes inspired by one man's midnight experiment. Still, McKenna never receives official recognition. His piano wire modification remains a footnote in the chaos of war, buried under classified reports and technical updates. But among the men who fly, his name spreads like a secret prayer. When they dive and the controls respond, when they pull out just above the treetops and live to tell the tale, they know who to thank. Years later, when the war is over and the world moves on, aviation historians will look back at the P-38's evolution. They'll see the data, the test flights, the engineering papers. But behind all of that lies one quiet truth. Sometimes the difference between life and death in war isn't a billion-dollar design. It's a few feet of piano wire, and a man who refuses to accept that something just can't be fixed. Lockheed's California plant was a kingdom of noise and invention. Rows of engineers, designers, and mechanics worked like men possessed, their lives revolving around blueprints, engines, and deadlines dictated by war. When word about McKenna's field modification reached them, most dismissed it at first. A piano wire? A field mechanic's improvisation? It sounded too crude, too unscientific. But when one of the company's senior test engineers, Ralph Verdon, heard about it, he ordered a detailed report. He knew the pilots weren't lying. Something was wrong with the Lightning's behavior at high speeds, and any clue, no matter how unlikely, was worth studying. Lockheed flew in a P-38 from England that carried the modification. It arrived scarred, patched, and battle-worn, a veteran of hundreds of hours in the European sky. But it carried McKenna's secret within its tail. The engineers crowded around as the mechanics disassembled it piece by piece. When they reached the elevator assembly, silence fell. There it was, a section of piano wire looped and reinforced, holding the control linkage steady. The engineers stared at it, dumbfounded. One of them whispered, "That's actually brilliant." They tested it, measured the tension, and ran simulations. The results were undeniable. The field modification was reducing the control stiffness caused by compressibility. McKenna's rough, improvised fix had exposed the weak point in the P-38's aerodynamic balance. In the days that followed, Lockheed's design rooms came alive with new urgency. Charts, sketches, and wind tunnel models filled the tables. The team began experimenting with ways to formalize the fix, not just to reinforce the controls, but to eliminate the root cause. Compressibility had been a ghost in aviation, something pilots felt but scientists barely understood. As planes approached the speed of sound, air pressure didn't behave linearly. It changed density, forming shock waves that locked control surfaces in place. This was the invisible enemy that was killing Lightning pilots. The engineers at Lockheed realized they couldn't simply fight it. They needed to outsmart it. They designed new aerodynamic surfaces under the wings, small hinged panels called dive recovery flaps. When a pilot entered a high-speed dive, these flaps could be extended to change the pressure distribution under the wings, reducing the nose-down moment and allowing the elevator to respond. It was a technical masterpiece born from battlefield desperation, and McKenna's wire was the spark that lit the fuse. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, the P-38 continued its deadly work. The pilots flying without the modification still faced the same terrifying problem. Many didn't make it back. Each dive was a gamble with physics. But then a new model began to arrive at the front lines, the P-38J, equipped with factory-installed dive recovery flaps and improved control linkages. It looked almost the same, but it handled like a different beast. The first time the new version hit the skies, pilots noticed the change immediately. The plane sliced through the air with confidence, and when they dove, the controls stayed alive beneath their hands. The old fear began to fade. Test pilots pushed it further. They dove from 30,000 feet straight down, speeds climbing past 400 miles per hour, then 450. The air howled. The wings trembled, but when they pulled back, the Lightning obeyed. The test reports were glowing. No sign of control freeze. Dive recovery successful. The engineers back in Burbank celebrated like soldiers after a long siege. They had conquered the invisible wall of air that had haunted them for years. For McKenna, word of these changes came quietly, through letters and rumors. He was still stationed in Europe, maintaining planes and training younger mechanics. When he saw the new Lightnings arrive, he noticed the changes instantly. The controls looked cleaner, the linkage tighter, the flaps under the wings new and purposeful. One of his friends nudged him and said, "Looks like someone up there finally listened." McKenna just smiled and went back to work. He didn't care about credit. He cared about the pilots. As the war dragged into 1944, the Lightning's reputation transformed. Once considered a dangerous, unpredictable aircraft, it became a precision weapon. American aces began scoring record victories in the twin-tailed fighter. In the Pacific, it became the long arm of vengeance, capable of flying missions too long for any other plane. Its most famous operation came on April 18, 1943, the interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. 4 P-38. Lightnings flew hundreds of miles across open ocean, guided by intelligence so secret it could have turned the tide of the war. When they found Yamamoto's transport, they struck like lightning from a clear sky. In minutes, the architect of Japan's attack lay dead in the jungle. The mission was so daring, so precise, that it became legendary. And at the heart of that success was the confidence the pilots had in their machine. A machine that could now dive, climb, and fight without fear of killing its own. But the story of the Lightning's rebirth wasn't just about design. It was about the relationship between man and machine, between those who fly and those who build. Every time a pilot climbed into a cockpit, he carried the invisible work of countless hands. The engineers in California, the factory workers, the mechanics in muddy airfields, and one stubborn sergeant who refused to accept that a plane couldn't be fixed. By late 1944, the P-38 had evolved into one of the most capable aircraft of the war. Its twin engines allowed it to keep flying even after taking heavy damage. Its range made it the first true long-distance escort fighter, and with the new aerodynamic refinements, it could outdive and outclimb most of its enemies. The Luftwaffe learned to fear its silhouette, the twin tails flashing in the sun before the guns opened up. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots called it 2 planes, 1 pilot. To them, it was an omen of death. Back at Lockheed, engineers continued to study the data from the field. They knew that compressibility wasn't just a P-38 problem. It was the frontier of aviation. Every new design, every faster aircraft would eventually face it. The lessons learned from McKenna's field modification and the Lightning's evolution became the foundation for the next generation of fighters. Jets were already on the horizon, machines that would routinely fly faster than sound. And when they did, they'd rely on the discoveries born from that one night in a foggy English hangar, where a man with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes decided to thread a length of piano wire through a problem nobody else could solve. The P-38 had started as an experiment, a daring twin-engine concept in an era when fighters were supposed to be small and single. Many thought it would fail, but by the end of the war it was more than just a plane. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, of courage under pressure, of what happens when creativity meets necessity. And at its core was a reminder that sometimes innovation doesn't come from laboratories or universities. Sometimes it comes from the hangar floor, from a man who looks at disaster and says quietly, "Not on my watch." When the war finally began to turn in the Allies' favor, the P-38 Lightning had already become a symbol of survival, a machine that had outlasted its own curse. The men who flew it trusted it completely now. They called it the fork-tailed devil, a name borrowed from terrified German pilots who had watched its twin booms flash past their canopies before being torn apart by gunfire. But behind that legend was a quiet truth. This machine had been rebuilt from near disaster. And the story of that rebirth began with one stubborn mechanic and a few feet of piano wire. By early 1945, the European skies were changing. Jet fighters like the German Me-262 had arrived, slicing through the air at speeds no propeller plane could match. The future was already knocking on the hangar doors. Yet even in this new era, the P-38 held its ground. Its long range and heavy armament made it perfect for ground attack missions, photo reconnaissance, and bomber escort duties that other fighters couldn't handle. The pilots who once cursed its deadly dive now pushed it to its limits, performing maneuvers that had been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. And every time they pulled out of a steep dive or felt the plane respond with smooth precision, They were living proof of what human ingenuity could do when desperation met determination. In the Lockheed test facilities back in California, the engineers continued to experiment. They were no longer just fixing a problem, they were learning from it. Compressibility, once a mysterious killer, was now a field of study. They used high-speed wind tunnels, new measuring instruments, and even primitive analog computers to model airflow at extreme velocities. What they found changed everything. The shock waves forming along the wings in a high-speed dive weren't just slowing the plane, they were changing how air flowed over the entire structure. Every control surface, every rivet, every curve mattered. To fight the phenomenon, engineers began designing wings that were thinner, sleeker, and more swept back. These experiments would later inspire the first generation of jet aircraft. The lessons learned from the Lightning's near-death experience became blueprints for the future. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, carried traces of the P-38's DNA, from its hydraulic control improvements to its dive recovery systems. Even though the two looked nothing alike, one had given birth to the other. The Lightning had been the bridge between the age of propellers and the dawn of the jet. But in the war zones, those lessons came at a cost. Thousands of men had died before the problem was understood. Their sacrifices wrote the rules of high-speed flight in blood and wreckage. McKenna knew that. Every time he saw a Lightning return riddled with bullet holes but still flying, he felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He would run his hand along the metal skin of the plane, listening to it tick and pop as it cooled down. He knew this machine better than most men knew themselves. It was alive, a living thing of steel, oil, and sweat. One evening, near the end of the war, McKenna sat outside the hangar, watching the sun go down behind the airfield. He could hear the distant sound of engines being tested, the roar echoing across the horizon. A young pilot sat next to him, barely 20, face smeared with oil and exhaustion. He asked, "Did you ever think we'd make it this far?" McKenna smiled faintly. "The plane or us?" The pilot laughed softly. "Both." McKenna looked up at the silhouette of a P-38 flying overhead, its twin tails gleaming against the sky. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you just need to give the right thing a little push to make it fly right." When peace finally came, the factories that had once produced thousands of planes a month began to fall silent. Assembly lines shut down, blueprints were filed away, and men who had lived on adrenaline and deadlines were suddenly out of work. Lockheed engineers scattered. Some went into commercial aviation. Others joined the secret projects that would define the Cold War. But they carried with them the lessons of the Lightning. Compressibility, control balance, aerodynamic shock. These weren't just problems anymore. They were the foundation of a new kind of flight. McKenna returned home quietly. There were no medals waiting for him, no public recognition. His name wasn't in any official reports, but among the pilots who knew, his reputation was legend. Years later, one of them, a retired colonel, wrote in his memoirs about a mechanic named Jim, who might have saved more lives than anyone ever knew. The story spread piece by piece across veteran gatherings and air shows. Nobody could quite remember his full name, but everyone knew the story of the piano wire. In the years after the war, the P-38's design became a subject of fascination. Aviation schools studied it as a case study in innovation. It wasn't perfect, no fighter ever was, but it had forced the world to learn about flight in a way nothing else could. From its failures came understanding. From its dangers came safety. The men who had once been terrified of diving in the Lightning now used those same principles to teach younger pilots how to control faster, deadlier machines. By the early 1950s, jets had fully taken over the skies. The Lightning, once a symbol of cutting-edge design, became a relic, parked in museums, sold for scrap, or abandoned in far-off airfields. But every new aircraft that took off owed something to it, from the sleek F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea to the supersonic F-104 Starfighter. The fingerprints of the P-38's engineers, and McKenna's simple wire, were everywhere. Each generation of aircraft carried a little bit of that same stubborn spirit. The irony was that for decades, nobody outside the aviation world even knew this story. To the public, the P-38 was just another warplane, another name in the long list of machines that won World War II. But to those who truly understood flight, it represented something much deeper, the moment when humanity first met the edge of the sound barrier and refused to back down. As the 1960s arrived, the world was racing towards space. Rockets replaced airplanes as the new frontier. Yet the engineers designing those rockets still relied on principles discovered in the war, on lessons from the Lightning's struggles with air pressure, control, and speed. McKenna's wire fix might have seemed small, but it was part of a chain of progress that stretched all the way to the stars. Somewhere in a small town, McKenna lived out his life in peace. He rarely spoke about the war. When neighbors asked, he would just smile and say, "I worked on airplanes." Only once, late in life, did he tell the full story to his grandson, who had brought home a school project about World War II. The boy asked, "Did you ever fly one?" McKenna chuckled and said, "No, but I helped them stay in the air." That night, as he looked out his window and watched the distant blink of an airliner crossing the sky, he felt something familiar, that same quiet satisfaction he'd felt standing under the Lightning all those years ago. The world had moved on, technology had changed, but the principle was eternal. Sometimes the smallest act of courage can echo for generations. Time has a way of burying even the greatest stories. The war ended, the world rebuilt, and the men who once lived inside the roar of engines faded quietly into the background. The P-38 Lightning, once the cutting edge of aviation, became a museum piece, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the faces of schoolchildren who had never known a world at war. But to the few who remembered, that twin-tailed fighter was more than just an artifact. It was a symbol of survival, innovation, and human stubbornness. Somewhere inside its rivets and control cables still lived the ghost of a man who refused to give up on it: James McKenna. In the years after the war, Lockheed grew into one of the most powerful names in aerospace. The same company that once built the P-38 went on to create legends: the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-117 Nighthawk. Every one of them carried traces of the lessons first learned in the Lightning's tortured dives. Compressibility, aerodynamic stability, and pilot feedback were no longer mysteries. They were engineering truths, carved into the DNA of modern flight. And while the names of famous test pilots and engineers filled the pages of history, the man who had sparked the change remained invisible, his contribution remembered only in stories told over coffee in veterans' halls and hangars. McKenna lived a simple life. After the war, he worked briefly for a civilian aircraft maintenance company, but the world had changed. The military no longer needed men like him, improvisers, rule breakers, thinkers who worked with their hands instead of charts. So he retired early, settled in a quiet town, and spent his days fixing tractors, radios, and sometimes the neighborhood kids' bicycles. He never talked much about what he'd done in the war, but sometimes when he heard the sound of an airplane overhead, he'd look up, eyes squinting at the sunlight, and smile faintly. One day in the late 1960s, a letter arrived, faded, official, and stamped with a Lockheed logo. Inside was a short note from an engineer named Harold Warren, one of the original members of the P-38 development team. The letter thanked him finally for what he'd done. Warren wrote that the story of the piano wire modification had become something of a legend inside the company, passed down to new engineers as an example of field innovation, a reminder that sometimes the best solutions come from the people closest to the problem. McKenna read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. He never showed it to anyone. But for the first time, he felt something like peace. Meanwhile, in museums across America, restored P-38s began to appear again. Volunteers polished their wings, replaced their old engines, and brought them back to life. When the engines started for the first time in decades, the sound rolled through the air like thunder. For the old pilots who came to watch, tears welled in their eyes. The Lightning had returned, not as a weapon of war, but as a piece of living history. Some of them told stories of dives that nearly killed them, of controls that froze, of a mysterious modification that changed everything. They spoke McKenna's name like a secret, unsure if anyone outside their small circle would ever understand. As the decades passed, aviation technology advanced beyond anything those men could have imagined. Supersonic jets, stealth technology, and digital flight controls took humans higher and faster than ever before. But even in the most advanced aircraft, the principles remained the same. Every pilot still trusted the men and women behind the machine. Every engineer still knew that sometimes the smallest detail, a wire, a hinge, A bolt could mean the difference between life and death. By the time McKenna was in his 70s, the world had moved on completely. The wars were history now, the heroes old and gray. One afternoon, his grandson, the same boy who once asked him about the war, came home with a book about the P-38 Lightning. Inside was a photo of the plane, sleek and menacing, twin tails cutting through the clouds. McKenna flipped through the pages, reading about the famous missions, the aces, the victories. There was no mention of him, of course. But near the end, in a small side paragraph about field modifications performed by ground crews, there was a single sentence. Some reports mention an improvised reinforcement using piano wire that improved elevator control during high-speed dives. He smiled. That was enough. In the last years of his life, he visited an air show where a fully restored P-38 was scheduled to fly. It was painted silver, the sunlight bouncing off its wings as it taxied down the runway. The engines roared to life, and that familiar twin sound he hadn't heard in decades. When it lifted off, graceful and effortless, McKenna stood quietly among the crowd. Nobody around him knew who he was. To them, he was just another old man watching an old plane. But as the lightning soared higher, banking against the blue sky, he whispered under his breath, "You fly right now." The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers, talking about the aircraft's history, its speed, its power, its missions in Europe and the Pacific. But McKenna wasn't listening. He was back in 1943, in that cold English hangar, standing beneath the silver belly of a wounded bird, trying to figure out how to keep it alive. The smell of oil, the sound of tools, the faces of the young pilots who trusted him, all of it came flooding back. He watched until the plane disappeared into the clouds, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like everything had come full circle. A few years later, James McKenna passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was buried with a small box of personal belongings, a few medals, some photographs, and that old Lockheed letter. At the funeral, his grandson placed a tiny piece of piano wire in the casket, a tribute to the legacy that had saved countless lives. Decades later, when historians revisited the development of the P-38 Lightning, they found fragments of his story in old field reports and maintenance logs, a few lines here and there about a wire reinforcement technique. No official name, no recognition. But as the details surfaced, aviation enthusiasts began piecing it together. They realized that behind the numbers and the engineering diagrams, there had been a human hand, one that refused to accept defeat. Today, in the modern age of flight, the story of James McKenna has become something of a legend among restorers and historians. They tell it not as a tale of heroism, but of craftsmanship, of what happens when someone decides to care just a little more than they have to. The P-38 Lightning still flies in air shows around the world, its engines thundering like they did 80 years ago, and every time it dives and pulls out gracefully, balanced and alive, it carries with it the spirit of that forgotten mechanic. In the end, the piano wire wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of ingenuity, of courage, of faith in the idea that even the smallest person can make the biggest difference. The world may have forgotten James McKenna's name, but every time a pilot trusts his plane, every time an engineer refuses to give up on a design, his story lives on, in the skies, in the machines, and in the quiet hum of engines that will never forget the man who taught them how to fly right.